The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We have to have a serious and frank conversation about Donald Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, today. It's sort of like when it's time for parents to have the talk with kids. It's time for us to have the talk about lawyer Rudy Giuliani. And what's important to understand about lawyer Rudy Giuliani is that he is a lawyer in the sense that he is, quote, Donald Trump's lawyer, but he's not a lawyer right now in the sense that he's going to try a case in court or would even be equipped to do that, because Giuliani's been out of the courtroom for, I mean, maybe 20 years, I don't know, 30 years almost since he's been involved in the mafia prosecutions in New York City, but 20, 30 years, something like that. So he's not really the type of lawyer right now who behaves like a lawyer in the sense that when he makes public comments about his client, he says only, they will be vindicated in court, period. He's doing something very different. He's a TV lawyer, sort of PR guy, crossover sort of thing, and arguably not a very good one, or an extraordinarily good one, depending on what you think the goal is of what he's doing. He has been for months now admitting things that are damaging to Donald Trump's case, but then backtracking and saying he didn't really mean it. So there's no collusion to, so what if there's collusion? And I never said there was no collusion. Or no payments have been made to Stormy Daniels. Yes, payments have been made, but they're totally legal, unremarkable payments of no legal consequence whatsoever. More recently, Trump would never talk to Michael Cohen to influence his testimony to, well, maybe they did talk, but so what? It would make sense that the president would talk to his lawyer. That gets us to the last 48 hours and just an incredible backtracking, even by Rudy Giuliani standards. And what's at issue right now is how much involvement did Donald Trump have in the Trump Tower Moscow project that eventually didn't happen, right? This was a project that was explored, but ultimately, as we know, there is no Trump Tower Moscow. Trump and his team have been pushing the narrative that Trump was not involved, that, yeah, it was a project with Trump's name on it, but Trump barely knew anything about it. He didn't really care one way or the other. He wasn't involved in the day-to-day or even the week-to-week or month-to-month. But we know generally that Donald Trump is extraordinarily involved in everything his companies are doing. He's known for cashing tiny checks of almost no money, to being involved in the negotiations over who's going to do the windows in projects all over the world for him. And we also know that he's super infatuated with Vladimir Putin. So it's very hard to believe that he wasn't up to speed on the Trump Tower Moscow project. And what Rudy Giuliani said in a New York Times interview Sunday admitted that. Giuliani quoted Trump. Okay, it's really important to understand this. Quoted Trump during this January 20th interview, which was 2 days ago with the New York Times. And Giuliani said that Trump told him, quote, the conversations were going on from the day I announced to the day I won, right? Conversations about Trump Tower Moscow were going on persistently throughout the campaign. Trump knew about them. He was aware of them. He was involved in that debate. That's not hard to believe, right? It seems Rudy Giuliani told the truth. Every indication, everything we know would be that Donald Trump was involved in the frequent discussions that were going on. Trump was likely part of them or directly involved in telling the people who were negotiating what to say and what to do. So the only shock here is that all of a sudden, Rudy Giuliani is admitting the obvious, but it just so happens to be the opposite of the story Donald Trump has been telling us for months now. But then we get to yesterday. One day later, Rudy Giuliani walks it back, and the explanation is, I can't call it evil genius because it's not genius. Maybe it's like idiot genius or something like that. Rudy Giuliani completely walking back the comments saying, quote, my recent statements about discussions during the 2016 campaign between Michael Cohen and then candidate Donald Trump about a potential Trump-Moscow project were hypothetical and not based on conversations I had with the president. Understand what Rudy Giuliani is saying here. He quoted Trump on January 20th. He quoted him saying, "This is what the president told me." And on January 21, he says, "No, that was a hypothetical quote of a client of mine of a conversation that didn't happen." Like, what I don't even understand, Pat, what it means that it's a hypothetical quote. Like, hypothetically, if what? It doesn't even make sense to call it hypothetically a quote. He either is quoting Donald Trump or he isn't. Like, have you ever heard of a hypothetical quote?
No, I'm starting to think that Rudy Giuliani is just playing a role here. Like, he'll put out a bunch of different defenses of Trump and his administration, and then they'll just try to see what sticks. Like, whichever defense he gets ridiculed the least for is the one they end up going with. That has to be it, because with all these gaffes that he's been making, there would be no justification to keep him around for this long as Trump's lawyer.
I don't understand why he is around unless this is a strategy, as we've talked about. And the other possibility is, I mean, it's hard to imagine, but is it possible Rudy doesn't know what hypothetical means? Is that even a remote possibility here? I can't really think that that's the case, because none of this makes any sense whatsoever. It's hypothetical if what? I've just never heard of a quote referred to as hypothetical. And then in his latest walk back, Rudy Giuliani appears to admit that there are recordings of Donald Trump and Michael Cohen talking about this. And of course, that now is scandal number 2 of the last 24 hours with Rudy Giuliani. And that's where I want to go next. So let's reset. Rudy Giuliani, Trump's so-called lawyer, but really, as I mentioned, a television PR lawyer, not a lawyer who's going to do stuff in court for Trump, makes one statement, then he walks it back. He calls it a hypothetical quote of the president. He says he really doesn't know. He's just getting up to speed on the facts. We've heard that from Rudy before. The latest example of this is, as I already told you in the first story today, he said in a January 20th New York Times interview that Donald Trump told him there were Trump Tower Moscow discussions going on, quote, "from the day I announced till the day I won." The next day, yesterday, January 21st, as I already told you, Rudy Giuliani walks it back and he says, no, that was a hypothetical quote. It wasn't an actual quote of what Donald Trump told me. It was a hypothetical quote, which of course makes no grammatical sense, and it makes no material sense. It makes no sense of any kind. Okay, very strange walk back. So then the New Yorker gets a hold of Rudy Giuliani and asks him about the walk back because it's so strange. And Rudy Giuliani, unprovoked, starts talking about tapes, which, as far as we knew, didn't even exist. Check out the transcript of this interview with the New Yorker and Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani says, "I guess the BuzzFeed story, I don't remember what it said about Cohen, but it said there was corroboration that the president talked to Cohen and told him to lie about, I guess it was, the Moscow proposal. There are no tapes. There are no texts. There is no corroboration that the president told him to lie. I can tell you, from the moment I read the story, I knew the story was false because I have been through all the tapes. I have been through all the texts. I have been through all the emails, and I knew none existed." To which the New Yorker obviously says, "Wait, what tapes have you gone through? Because we're not aware of any such tapes." And Rudy Giuliani says, "I shouldn't have said tapes. They alleged there were texts and emails that corroborated what Cohen was saying the president told him to lie. There were no texts, there were no emails, and the president never told him to lie. Well, I have listened to tapes, but none of them concern this." Can anyone really be this dumb? Or is it possible that Pat's right, which is that this is just idiocy as a strategy? The idea being that Giuliani is a lawyer only in that he has a law degree. But for Trump, he's a PR guy on TV. And as a PR guy on TV, he's not actually trying to make a legal argument. He's not stating what the president's legal position is on any of this stuff. He is not even really trying to appeal to the rational audience. He's trying to keep Trump's base engaged and reasonably giving some plausible deniability that they can say, we don't think Trump actually did anything wrong. So he's going out there and deliberately sowing confusion. He says A, and then he says the opposite of A. And it's all to muddy the waters. It's all to make it impossible to actually know what's going on and to keep the Trumpists relatively happy that everything's fine and Trump is just a great guy. The part that's difficult for me to believe about that, Pat, is that I just don't think Giuliani's a good enough actor to this fluidly or this genuinely seem as though he actually spoke mistakenly. Like if this was planned to now float the idea of tapes and then immediately say, I didn't mean that, there actually aren't any tapes, I just don't think the guy's a good enough actor to pull it off.
Isn't that where the term useful idiot comes from? Like maybe he doesn't realize that he's playing that role. He's genuinely trying to do a good job, but he keeps falling flat on his face. And they realize, the administration does, that this is good for them, and that's why they keep him going.
And the important thing with that idea, again, is none of Rudy Giuliani's media interviews are assertions about Trump's legal position at a matter is in terms of what he's telling Robert Mueller, for example. This is just Rudy running his mouth on TV. It's not legally binding in that sense. But if tapes genuinely exist, we've suspected that for some time. Now the question becomes, will we ever actually get access to them? So this could be idiocy. It could be deliberately planting conflicting stories. But importantly, it's only incidentally relevant what Rudy Giuliani says from a legal standpoint. The question we're left with is, do the tapes exist? What do you think? I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show's on Twitter at dpacman. We'll take a David Pakman Show, rather. We'll take a quick break and be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Scott Thompson. Scott, thanks so much for supporting the show. Also, Julie Frazier is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. She's been with us almost 5 years. Scott and Julie, thank you. And of course, as we found out on a recent live stream, the program is produced for everybody. It doesn't matter whether you can afford to make any contribution or not. What is important is that if you can throw a few bucks our way, that you choose to do so in order to make the programming possible for everybody. And that's what Scott did, that's what Julie did, and that's what you can do if you sign up at www.joinpacman.com. Also, on February 2nd, the day of my birthday, with peace and love, no gifts. No gifts will be accepted. I am channeling Ringo Starr in saying that. But we will have just a massive membership discount on February 2nd. And if you want to be notified about that, this is like a really big discount, arguably the biggest of the year. People are saying, that's what I'm reading and saw on Fox and Friends this morning. You can get on our mailing list at davidpakman.com, subscribe to the mailing list newsletter. I forget what it's called on our website. And on February 2nd, you will be notified by email of this just amazing membership special, which is the best possible birthday gift you could give me if you care about that. And if you don't, then let's just get into the news. We have had another national holiday and another complete and total faux pas disaster from the Trump administration. This was Vice President Mike Pence, who you might recall refers to his mom as mother and won't go places without a chaperone if he's with women other than his wife. Mike Pence, our buddy, likened Donald Trump to Martin Luther King Jr. in an interview on television the day before Martin Luther King Day 2019. Quick note, we did do a new show on Martin Luther King Day this year. People very, very angry when we don't. And we did it because the holiday schedule at the end of the year ended up with a bunch of days off. We felt, let's do a show because we've been off a lot. So I will tell you that in 2020, we probably won't be doing a show on Martin Luther King Day. But back to our story. Mike Pence interviewed on CBS's Face the Nation. He's pressed about the latest Trump proposal to end the government shutdown with funding for the border wall. And Pence, out of nowhere, comes in and compares or likens Donald Trump to Martin Luther King, surprising not just everybody on the set, but a majority of the country and the world as well. That's not really a comparison most people would think to make. But alas, here is Mike Pence making it.
Bring together the Democrats' priorities to accomplish that. That's what the American people expect us to do. And honestly, the hearts and minds of the American people today are thinking a lot about it being the weekend where we remember the life and work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King was, "Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy." You think of how he changed America. He inspired us to change through the legislative process to become a more perfect union. That's exactly what President Trump is calling on the Congress to do. Come to the table in a spirit of good faith.
What's particularly infuriating to me about all of these right-wingers now acting like Martin Luther King was just the best and Trump's like him and we're remembering Martin Luther King, that a lot of them would have hated Martin Luther King if they had been around at the same time. There's just no question about that. And to Pence's comment, I guess it's true in the sense that Martin Luther King inspired people to change for the better, and Donald Trump has inspired people to change for the worse by galvanizing and activating the white nationalists and the white supremacists and the alt-right and all these horrible elements of society. This is the second man in line for the presidency, and he's at least claiming off of a quote he read off of a piece of paper that was off to his left there at least, that he believes Donald Trump is like Martin Luther King. And the comparison could just not be more ridiculous. A man who fought racism compared to a man who has reinvigorated more racism than any recent president, I guess other than Obama, merely by virtue of being black, which really did agitate the racists, but that's sort of a different story. And I don't know what's more outrageous, Pence saying that Trump is like Martin Luther King, or Trump saying that he believes himself to be sort of like Abraham Lincoln. Both are crazy. And in the interests of trying to find some silver lining here or some other way that maybe this could be true, I sort of found one, Pat, which is that Martin Luther King inspired people to make changes to improve this country. It's possible that by being president, Donald Trump will inspire people to not only vote him out, but also to make sure that nothing like this atrocity of a presidency ever happens again. And maybe that would be the one way that both could have inspired positive change.
Well, that's certainly a stretch, but less of a stretch than Mike Pence's example was. I hate when Republicans go on and on about how Martin Luther King would be a Republican if he was living today. Like, the guy died 50 years ago. We were in such a different political time then. It's really hard to say what his politics would be like. But given the fact that Martin Luther King praised democratic socialism on many accounts, I think he would have more a lot in line with, say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders than he would with Donald Trump and Mike Pence.
Yeah, it's very hard to imagine that in 2019, Martin Luther King Jr. says, Trump, Pence, that's who I'm voting for. Extraordinarily difficult to imagine that. And seriously, do you think that this is delusion? Do you think this is compulsive lying? Is it trolling? Is it just being bad people or trying to come up with interesting things to say on TV? I really don't know which it is. It might just be malignant ignorance in the end.
He's just trying to be a savvy politician, tie in the holiday with his agenda at the moment. That's all Mike Pence is trying to do here.
Would have been much more credible feeling if he didn't have to look down at that piece of paper to read the quote, but I guess nobody's perfect, right? Yesterday on the bonus show, I told you that Donald Trump claims to be planning another summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Supposedly this is going to happen at the end of February. And you might remember that that first meeting they had in Singapore was just an absolute and total failure. The media coverage was sort of glowing, at least from some enclaves. Trump certainly claimed victory during the flight back from Singapore, but nothing has happened. We have no reason to think that North Korean nuclear development has stopped. We still haven't heard a thing about getting those remains of American soldiers repatriated back to the United States. We now have a report that claims that it's actually maybe even worse than we thought in North Korea, because researchers have found a secret ballistic missile base in North Korea, which the North Koreans haven't even admitted exists as a missile base. It's a facility that we're aware of, but we didn't know until more recently that it appears to be a missile base. And the report says that there may be as many as 20 of these previously undisclosed missile testing sites. The one that they name specifically is the Sino-Ri missile operating base, where ballistic missiles are being developed. And these are the types of missiles that could potentially be used to deliver a nuclear warhead, which, of course, North Korea is also developing. This is a report from defense think tank CSIS through a project of theirs called Beyond Parallel. The White House was asked for comment as of this morning. They have not given a comment. It's important to understand that if North Korea doesn't disclose somewhere between 1 and 20 missile sites, those aren't missile sites that could be on the negotiating table for Donald Trump, since they're not even disclosed and acknowledged. And to be clear, the U.S. has known about a lot of these locations as places where things have been going on. But the big news here is that it has become a missile facility, and something that's neither here nor there in evaluating the sort of logic behind Donald Trump's summits with Kim Jong-un and the number of facilities that they may have for missile testing is the topic of chemical warfare. It's not mentioned much within North Korea, but it's a big, big threat. There's a report from 10 years ago that North Korea has a stockpile of somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 metric tons of chemical weapons. And this includes some of the common ones: mustard gas, sarin, and some other less common nerve agents, which of course could do huge, huge damage to neighboring countries. And for me, the fear isn't so much that North Korea is going to, on a whim, out of nowhere, unilaterally attack the United States or our allies or their neighbors. It's more that when you have erratic people like Trump dealing with them, they may end up retaliating or reacting in a disastrous way. And everything is just opposite with Trump when it comes to this stuff. He says on the flight back from Singapore after the first summit on Twitter, North Korea is no longer a threat. Turns out they potentially have 20 more missile sites than what we even knew about. They said last week ISIS has been defeated on the same day that they attack and kill 4 people. And within 5 days, another suicide attack just a few days later. I don't know, Pat, what there is to gain from having Donald Trump sit down with Kim Jong-un again. Do you think that there's even a chance that a second summit could actually accomplish anything?
No, and I mean, if these conversations were being had in good faith, then you'd have to cancel the meeting, right? Why would you have a second summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un if they're adding nuclear missile facilities? You would definitely want to cancel the meeting. But of course, the White House is staying silent on this. They want to have that second summit because it's good PR for the president, and the media seems to fawn over it.
The funniest thing for me still is that Donald Trump genuinely seems to think of it as an accomplishment that Kim Jong-un was willing to meet with him. Like, Trump seems to be thinking about this like, wow, I secured a meeting with Kim Jong-un, which is extraordinarily difficult to do. And of course, if you have any knowledge of the backstory and the last 20 years or even more with North Korean leaders, you know that they've always wanted to get a meeting with an American president in order to get those pictures and the propaganda value and being able to say, we're on the same level as an American president. And it's been the American presidents who have said, well, in order to really have the conversation about meeting, we're going to have to get some agreement via some preconditions need to be established. And there's going to have to be some concessions made by the North Korean leader before we even meet. That seems to not even enter into Trump's mind. He seems to think that it's an incredible accomplishment just to have been able to get a meeting with Kim Jong-un. And I'm not sure if anybody in the White House is explaining to him that that's not the case. My question to you, do you support a second summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un? And if you do, please tell me why, because at this point, I can't think of any good reason for this to go forward. Make sure you're following me on Instagram at david.pacman, and make sure you follow the show on Instagram at David Pacman Show, where I believe it's tomorrow, if Pat allows it, that I will be answering questions on our Instagram page from the audience. We'll see. I'll talk about that tomorrow, if indeed it is happening.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. Welcome back to the David Pacman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Tom Gjelten, who's the religion and belief correspondent for NPR News, also author of the book A Nation of Nations, a great American immigration story. Tom, it's so great to have you. And there's so many different places we could start given the discussion that's taking place right now around immigration policy. Maybe one place to start is, as someone who's been covering this for some time, is what we are seeing right now a sort of new era in attitudes towards immigration that we're seeing from the current administration, or is it actually going back to something we've seen before in a sense?
Well, yes and no, David. I mean, it's immediately reminiscent of a debate that we had just over 50 years ago at the time of the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act, when we really had to decide and did decide what kind of immigration we wanted for this country. But in a sense, it even goes back all the way to the beginning of our republic. The interesting thing is that the United States is almost unique among the countries of the world in that most countries come into being with the people already there on the land. So they don't really have to decide what kind of country they're going to be in terms of the culture, in terms of the country as a nation. The United States was formed really as a new nation, and people were coming from different areas. And so there was this question from the beginning, this idea at the beginning that we could be a universal nation. I mean, George Washington famously said, "The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions." Now, that was the ideal. That was the aspiration. But it was counteracted in a sense by the reality of prejudice, which was there from the beginning. And it was really only in 1965 that we were able to reconcile this aspiration of our country as a universal nation with the reality that for most of the first 200 years of our settlement, we were prejudiced against immigrants of color, immigrants from really anywhere other than Northwest Europe. And finally, in 1965, we had a new Immigration Act that clearly opened America's doors for the first time in an official way to immigrants of color. Now, there was a lot of debate around whether that was a right thing to do or not. And it's, in a sense, we are now revisiting that debate 50 some years later.
Yeah, so you mentioned the 65 law, which up until then, we had a circumstance or situation of quotas to allocate immigrant visas based on countries of origin. When we hear things like, we've got to figure out what's going on with Muslim immigration, or we're taking Syrian immigration off of the table, or we would prefer people from Norway rather than Haiti or whatever other countries. That, in a sense, seems reminiscent of this kind of prioritization or tiers of people that is a pre-1965 sort of circumstance. Is that right?
Exactly right, David. And it's really interesting to me because, it's almost word for word in many ways the debate that we had in Congress in 1965 around the decision of whether to do away with national origin quotas. You might think that that debate was left behind, but strangely, we're hearing some of the very same words. I mean, if you go back to that 1965 debate, you had members of Congress saying, we really don't want immigrants from Africa. We don't want immigrants from Asia. That's not part of what America is. That's not our heritage, our culture. Those arguments were definitively rejected in the context of the Civil Rights Movement. The 1965 Immigration Act passed by a large margin. And yet here we are in 2019, 2018, hearing some of those very same arguments. I mean, when President Trump said that we don't want, as you suggested, we don't want immigrants from shithole countries, that was very close to what opponents of the 65 Immigration Act were saying at that time.
I'd love to get your thoughts on the kind of the talking point push-pull that we're seeing on this issue among some, where you hear the perspective that, as you're pointing out, empirically, this is a nation of immigrants. And then the opposition says, well, yes, but things have changed because now we have an established country. We're not in this kind of manifest destiny early phase. And then the other side comes back and says, well, hold on a second. If you think back to when the immigration from Europe was happening, we were seeing a sort of ranking of immigrants. Irish were considered others. Italians, typically from the south of Italy, were considered others. Now they are part of the in crowd, and it's a new group that is sort of being otherized and marginalized. Is there actually an empirical difference that we can draw, or is it sort of a repetition of that same attitude?
Well, the original bias was in favor of immigrants, as you suggest, from Northwest Europe. And towards the end of the 19th century, when we saw a surge of immigrant populations from Mediterranean countries and from Eastern Europe, Slavic countries, including Jews, there was a lot of opposition to that. At that time, there really wasn't much of a anticipation of immigration from outside Europe altogether. So that wasn't at that time a huge issue. You know, it just what's happened in the aftermath of the 1965 Immigration Act. Is you want to look at data. In 1960, 7 out of 8 immigrants were coming from Europe, to include Southern and Eastern Europe, but from Europe, 7 out of 8 immigrants. After the passage of the 1965 Act, in 2000, 9 out of 10 immigrants to the United States were coming from outside Europe. So in that 35-year period, a total and dramatic transformation in the character of our immigrant population. And that sort of set the stage for this debate that we're having now, a real kind of anxiety on the part of some Americans that, you know, that our heritage is really changing. Now, you mentioned something interesting that I think is important to point out. Throughout most of our history, there hasn't really been much debate around this notion that we are a nation of immigrants. Now we are actually seeing a debate about that. There are voices largely on the right who are saying, you know, we're not really a nation of immigrants, we're a nation of settlers. And they're distinguishing between immigrants and settlers or pioneers in the sense that settlers and pioneers built the country, and then immigrants, seeing the United States already built, already powerful, already prosperous, wanted to come in and take advantage of that. And so there's this distinction between immigrants and settlers, which is something that, boy, I never came across that ever before in the history of our country.
Yeah, so like as a correspondent who covers this stuff, when you hear that brought up, you've not heard this distinction before between settlers and immigrants, and now we're hearing it, or with any of the other distinctions that are being made. Yes, immigration before is different than immigration now, or any of these distinctions.
Yeah.
How can you examine on as close to an objective basis as possible whether what underlies that is or may be racism or xenophobia, as some suggest, or whether the defense that, no, we're talking here about a country that has limited resources, and at a certain point, decisions have to be made about who gets to come in or who doesn't, or the idea of losing status or the driving down of wages, as the talking point goes. How can you as a reporter say, okay, I'm hearing the assertion, let's now examine what really is underlying it?
That's a really astute question, David. And I would say that the important change or the distinction to be made is between those who are nervous about the numbers of immigrants coming in and fearing, therefore, that the sheer quantity of immigration could jeopardize, job prospects for native-born Americans. That is one concern. That's a concern about numbers. And then there is a concern about culture, which really has nothing to do with the numbers of immigrants coming in. It has to do with the kind of immigrants who are coming in. That's a very different argument. Those are the arguments that emphasize sort of a threat to our heritage, our Western traditions, our civilization. It's an argument about identity, about culture. I think those are two very different arguments. The first one, I think you would have a hard time arguing that is essentially a racist argument. It's a kind of an economic argument. It can be debated both ways. The second one, because it emphasizes cultural differences, I think that's a lot more problematic.
Are the lines clear in your mind in terms of the parties, the two major parties, and this issue? And to add some context to that, the discussion around the shutdown and the wall is mostly dividing among party lines. So you have people on the left who tend to be against the wall and people on the right who, all else being equal, are generally more in favor of the wall proposed by the president. But if you look a little bit wider, like the last 30 years, you had a Republican in Ronald Reagan who was granted some degree of amnesty, through to Trump, who wants to build this wall and is talking about shithole countries. Even on the Democratic side, you had deportation records set by President Barack Obama, and now this push towards in some areas, sanctuary cities and opposition to the wall. So to get back to the question, are the lines as clear as they might seem in terms of party and this issue?
They've really changed, David. There is a strong argument to be made that the U.S. economy depends on immigrant labor, that immigrants actually, particularly now with a relatively low unemployment, that there's a real demand for immigrant labor. And if you look sort of traditionally at the arguments around the debate around immigration, you have groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that has traditionally taken a pretty pro-immigration point of view. And, libertarian groups, Cato Institute is very much pro-immigrant. And the traditional Republican ideology has been much more aligned with these economic arguments from business groups like the Chamber of Commerce, and sort of seeing the contribution that immigrant labor makes to the economy. As the Republican Party has moved in a more sort of ideological direction to emphasize cultural issues, you really see a change in that regard. There's also been a change on the Democratic side. Back in the early 80s, let's say during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the Democratic Party was pretty strongly influenced by organized labor. Organized labor at that time, labor unions were largely representing white workers, and there was a lot of anxiety among the labor movement about immigration. And you had some pretty prominent Democratic leaders back then that were made very clear their nervousness about immigrant labor. I mean, people like Eugene McCarthy or the Congresswoman from Texas, Barbara Jordan, had a lot of concern about immigrant labor for fear of the impact it would have on particularly African-American workers. And now, as the economy has changed, the Democratic Party represents a lot more workers of color. You don't see that argument being made, the sort of the nervousness about immigration. You don't see that at all in the Democratic Party anymore. And conversely, in the Republican side, you see very few voices who are sort of making the traditional pro-immigrant argument that we associated with the business lobby in the past.
Along these partisan lines, the last thing I wanted to touch on was this issue of the corporations that benefit from hiring undocumented immigrants. That has been effectively missing from the discussion. Obviously, the president lobbying for his wall is going to scapegoat undocumented immigrants as the ones responsible for holding down wages. But you don't really hear a serious critique from either side about the reality that it's the corporations that are basically going unpunished for hiring undocumented labor that are really the driving force behind a lot of that hiring and wages. Is there just no political appetite to open up that can of worms?
That's an interesting point. There is this idea of e-verify that would sort of require employers to verify the immigrant status of workers that they hire, sort of electronically against the database.
Yeah.
The business community has been notably reticent about that. Democrats, have been somewhat cool to that as well. As a result, it really hasn't gotten very far. It's a little hard for me to sort of probe exactly why that is. We do know this, that the structure of our economy has changed dramatically in the last 50 years. We've seen huge growth in the service sector, and particularly in those parts of the service sector that do depend on low-skilled labor, whether it's yard work, lawn servicing and landscape, whether it's restaurant, the kind of service workers in restaurants, whether it's construction. The demand for unskilled labor, the kinds of jobs that immigrants are primed to fill, has really grown a lot. And that may be why you're not seeing a lot of corporations or businesses right now leading the charge against undocumented workers because, they are employing them.
No question about it. We've been speaking with Tom Gjelten, who's the religion and belief correspondent for NPR News. We're linking to his book, A Nation of Nations, A Great American Immigration Story. Tom, thank you so much for talking to me.
It's been really interesting. Thank you, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I've got for you today a true identity politics fail for you, which is really just a good illustration for why political arguments and debates that are based on the participants' actual or perceived identities are so problematic. And I've been lobbying the left not to engage in them, period, because there's just no upside. This one has to do with David Webb, who's truly a horrible right-wing Tea Partier with deplorable politics. I mean, really, the term enemy is a very polarizing term, but really an enemy of everything that progressives hold dear and value and fight for. And David Webb's been around for a little while now, I think maybe since, at least in the political landscape, since 2010, when the Tea Party movement really got going. And he has a show on Sirius XM radio. He was interviewing a legal analyst named Ariva Martin, and this was a radio interview. Ariva was on the phone, not in the same room as David Webb. And at a certain point during this interview, Ariva Martin claims that David Webb has been able to obtain the position he has in media as a host of Sirius XM radio, on Sirius XM radio, because of David Webb's white privilege. And of course, the problem with that is that David Webb is a black man, and he mentions this, and it becomes just a completely cringeworthy incident that I want to listen to with you right now.
I've chosen to cross different parts of the media world, done the work so that I'm qualified to be in each one. I never considered my color the issue. I considered my qualifications the issue.
Well, David, that's a whole nother long conversation about white privilege and things that you have the privilege of doing that people of color don't have the privilege of.
How do I have the privilege of white privilege?
David, by virtue of being a white male, you have white privilege. This whole long conversation, I don't have time to get into it.
Ariva, I hate to break it to you, but you should have been better prepped. I'm black.
Okay, then I stand.
See, you went to white privilege. This is the falsehood in this. You went immediately with an assumption. Your people, obviously, or you didn't look. You're talking to a black man who started out in rock radio in Boston.
This is the real problem with identity politics, okay? Is white privilege real in the United States? Of course it is. Should we talk about white privilege? Absolutely. But when you accuse a specific person of holding a position in society, in this case, David Webb's job, or a political opinion, because of their privilege, you instantly lose, because now, think about what she's saying. She happened to be wrong about him having white privilege because he's not white. But what's implicit in this entire thing is that if he had been white, his particular success would be specifically attributable to white privilege. And then you've got to get into a debate about that. What are you going to win by demonstrating that? Because you're ultimately not going to be able to do that beyond any kind of doubt. This is like telling a person that you perceive to be gay or straight that their view on gay rights is merely because they are gay or because they are straight. And then they say, no, actually, I'm the other thing, right? If you say, well, you only have that view because you're gay. And the person says, actually, I'm straight. And this happens often with anti-gay activists. And when we used to interview more of them on the show, it would happen to me. I would be interviewing some homophobe, and they would say, David, you have that view because you're a gay man. And as soon as I say, no, I'm not, I'm a straight ally, they immediately implode and the argument goes in the trash. David Webb is a horrible right-winger. I mean, truly, his views are deplorable. The Tea Party is horrifying. There's so much to criticize. You lose from the get-go when you say you have white privilege to a black guy. And this is not a disagreement over whether white privilege exists. It sounds like Areva Martin thinks white privilege is real, and I believe that white privilege is real in the United States. This is about the absolutely boneheaded way in which she claimed a black guy has a radio show because of his white privilege, and it points to the same problem that I mentioned earlier. If he had the same career but were white, she would have felt justified that he in particular has his job because of white privilege, and that's non-defeasible. Like, how can you prove to her that that's not the case? It was short-circuited here because he happens to be black, and the argument could not possibly be right in this case. But here's the real issue that comes up. David Webb is black and therefore doesn't have white privilege. But Webb also doesn't believe white privilege exists, Pat, and that's where he's wrong. Areva Martin face-planted with her comment. David Webb's view that white privilege doesn't exist is now reinforced because she failed so miserably, and that's why this is so destructive.
Yeah, always argue the merits because you don't necessarily know what the identity of the person that you're talking to is. Like, many people don't know that you're culturally Hispanic, for example. Race, that's generally easy to tell, but if you're having a conversation over the phone, you might not be able to. So if you want to bring up identity as maybe like a secondary or tertiary point, that's all well and good. You can discuss that as a footnote, but it should not be the primary conversation you're having. Argue the merits.
In particular, because the discussion about white privilege can't be about David Webb, no matter what his race is, right? It needs to be a case that you can make regardless of the race of the person you're speaking to. It's really just horrible. And I know that people are going to say, David, you shouldn't be giving this any attention because now right-wing media is going to run with it. No, right-wing media already ran with it. I'm giving you this as an example of how white privilege shouldn't be used politically as something you accuse individuals of having. This is a dumb mistake about one person's white privilege, but it completely destroys a lot of the standing that the left has to point out the real issues with white privilege, which have nothing to do with David Webb in particular. Fox News hilariously and tragically made a false report of the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg yesterday. Of course, she's 85. She's been recovering from surgery to remove cancerous nodules from a lung, and she's had her fair share of health issues over the years. Donald Trump's favorite show, Fox and Friends, was the place where this happened. And imagine what people thought when this image came up of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1933 to 2019 on the screen, identical to those images you see on television networks when famous people pass away. They mistakenly put it up on screen when trying to go to yet another segment on the horrible things that are happening on college campuses. It's just everything about this. It's perfect. They want to do a segment about how horrible college campuses have become, and they incorrectly put up an image claiming that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has passed away. They ended up doing an apology for it. Here it is, and very, very awkward on set as they apologize for this error.
That's right. In the meantime, we need to apologize. At the beginning of Ainsley's interview with the professor, a technical error in the control room triggered a graphic of Ruth Bader Ginsburg with a date on it. We don't want to make it seem anything other than that was a mistake, that was an accident. We believe she is still at home recovering from surgery. Big
we
mistake.
Apologize.
And the control
Big
room.
Mistake, yes.
Indeed. All right. Meanwhile, let's talk a little bit
about Steve Doocy sounding super, super sincere, credible, and alpha there during that explanation, right? So clearly they had the image ready. They're ready and waiting to put it up on screen at a moment's notice. And what wasn't a mistake is that someone was told to make the graphic. And there's people who are defending this by saying, David, it's logical that they would have this image and dozens or even hundreds of others for famous people who are getting up there in age. But what doesn't make as much sense is that before a graphic like this would be sort of filed in a way where with a single click, it would just go out live to air, means that it has to have been approved by multiple producers that this is the image that they would be using when that horrible day sometimes comes in the future. So it makes sense that they'd have the image, but it makes a little bit less sense to me that it could be accidentally triggered to end up live on air in this way. but the continuing saga of technical errors on Fox News. Imagine, we know Donald Trump loves Fox and Friends. Imagine Donald Trump yesterday morning sitting there in the residence at the White House or in the Oval Office or just in some room where there's a TV on in the background and he's watching that instead of listening to his presidential daily briefing or whatever he does. Imagine that image coming up, and at least for a fraction of a second, President Donald Trump thinking that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has passed away and he's going to get a chance to put another Supreme Court justice on the court. Not for now, Donald, not today. And I think that that's good news for everybody. We have a voicemail number. That number is 2192 David P. Here's a caller who makes an assertion about the minimum wage. Let's take a listen to it and figure out if it makes sense.
Hey, David. As you might know, in 2019, Massachusetts' minimum wage went up from $11 an hour to $12 an hour as part of a law that will increase the state's minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2023. While this is great for workers being able to afford a living in our state, it does not reflect the increase in productivity that workers have had in the last few decades. Do you think we should continue to push our legislators to increase minimum wages past $15 in states and cities that have won the fight for $15? Let me know, and thanks for the show.
Absolutely good point. So a couple different things here. Number one is, what would the productivity adjusted wage be? And number two, we have other ways that we can also index the minimum wage. So if you go back to 1968, which is often kind of like the base year for a lot of these indices, if you were to do a productivity adjusted wage with 1968 as the base year, we would be at $19.33. Now, these are averages. They don't reflect different industries, different parts of the country. But for sure, even in Massachusetts, which has one of the most sort of forward-looking and closest to a living wage, minimum wages, it is not yet tracking productivity. Now, there are different arguments to be made about how the minimum wage should be indexed. So you could index it to inflation. You could index it to cost of living, which would be tough to do federally because cost of living just varies so much from state to state and even within cities and metropolitan areas compared to rural areas. Or you could do it on the basis of productivity. And there would be pros and cons to any of those. But there is no question, anybody who is making these cartoonish arguments about the minimum wage has just gone up way, way too much, I don't know of any indicator, any sort of barometer you can apply, be it productivity, inflation, cost of living, or others. I don't know of any actual objective empirical justification that demonstrates that the minimum wage is too high. All of them that I've seen suggest that it is either too low or, according to some indicators, roughly where it's supposed to be. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We'll talk about Mike Pence's wife teaching art at a school that bans gay students and parents in 2019. It's really happening, yeah. We'll also talk about the insanely cold temperatures in the Northeast, which do nothing to refute climate change. And lastly, we'll talk about a claim that Prince Philip is insensitive not to wear a seatbelt when he drives around after a recent crash in which he was involved. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.